again to everyone from New Mexico and Maine for joining today. It's now my pleasure to introduce U.S. Senator Martin Heinrich, who has worked for years to advance pragmatic bipartisan policies to save lives, improve public safety, and reduce gun violence. With that, Senator Heinrich, you have the floor.
Thank you, Katie, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. There have been more mass shootings in the United States than days in 2023. Let that sink in for a moment. Far too many Americans and communities from Lewiston, Maine to Farmington, New Mexico have lost loved ones in mass shootings, and we can't bring back those we've lost. But lawmakers can save lives through common sense gun safety measures. We can pass laws that regulate the inherently dangerous and unusually lethal firearms that mass shooters have wielded against our communities. And that's precisely what Senator Angus King and I are doing by introducing the Gas-Operated Semi-Automatic Firearms Exclusion Act, or GO-SAFE. And we also have Senators Mark Kelly of Arizona and Michael Bennet of Colorado joining us as original co-sponsors. Our legislation addresses the unusual and inherently dangerous characteristics of the gas-operated actions, high-capacity magazines, and conversion devices that are fueling our nation's alarming rise in mass shootings. Put another way, we had to answer the question, just what is an assault weapon? This bill defines it in mechanical terms. It's the combination of a gas-operated action and a detachable high-capacity magazine. The GO-SAFE Act draws a bright line between traditional firearms used for hunting and sporting, for self-defense, and these weapons of war that we see too often in mass shootings. We focused on the lethality of firearms' internal mechanisms, as opposed to cosmetic features that individuals or even manufacturers can easily modify. AR-15s or assault rifles, the weapons in a number of mass shootings, aren't dangerous because of how they look. They're not dangerous because they look tactical or they're spray painted black or they have a folding stock. They're dangerous because they use expanding gas to simultaneously fire one round and reload the next round into the chamber while staying on target. The weapon's primary limitation is how quickly a shooter can pull the trigger. And when you pull the trigger on an AR-15, that doesn't actually fire multiple times. But before the round even exits the barrel, the weapon has already begun to chamber the next round. Trapping high-pressure gases in order to cycle these actions also reduces kickback. And that means you can fire the weapon multiple times very quickly and very accurately. These gas-operated mechanisms are what allow civilian mass shooters to walk into public spaces, destroy human life at a rapid pace, and even outgun law enforcement. And that's the primary aspect of firearms that the GO-SAFE Act targets for regulation. Our bill prevents modifications to firearms that convert them to fully automatic weapons. It limits the number of rounds in a magazine, and it specifically prohibits detachable magazines in combination with those gas-operated actions. Finally, it outlaws self-manufactured ghost guns, detachable high-capacity magazines, and conversion devices like Glock switches and bump stocks. Our bill purposely exempts firearms that have established self-defense, hunting, and sporting uses. Under the GO-SAFE Act, gun owners would be allowed to retain all of their current firearms that were lawfully owned before the law goes into effect. But to prevent the stockpiling of lethal weapons and large capacity magazines, transfers of regulated firearms would only be allowed between immediate family members. Our bill also creates a voluntary buyback program to allow gun owners to turn over and receive compensation for non-transferable firearms and magazines. This will ensure that lawful owners don't lose the monetary value of firearms already in their possession. Look, like a lot of Americans and many of my constituents in New Mexico, I'm a gun owner. Many of my best memories involve the responsible, law-abiding use of firearms to fill my freezer and feed my friends and family. But I also firmly believe that our families and children should feel safe when they go to a bowling alley, when they enter the classroom, or they go to a place of worship. They shouldn't have to live in fear that they might fall victim to the next mass shooting tragedy. And I refuse to accept the premise that Democrats and Republicans or gun safety advocates and gun owners are so divided that we can't take common sense actions that save lives. Last year, I was proud to play a leading role in the negotiations that led up to the bipartisan Safer Communities Act. That was the first significant federal gun safety law that Congress has passed in nearly 3 decades. We proved that it is possible for lawmakers to find agreement on measures that protect our communities from gun violence while safeguarding our Second Amendment rights. But we still need to get those inherently dangerous and unusually lethal firearms that are fueling our nation's skyrocketing rise in mass shootings off the streets. That's exactly what the Go Safe Act will do. And I am so proud to partner with my colleague, my friend from Maine, Senator Angus King, to build the support and momentum that we're going to need to pass this in the Senate. Senator King has been resolute that Congress must respond to the unspeakable loss of life in Lewiston, Maine, with legislation that will protect our communities from similar preventable gun violence. It's an honor, Senator King, to turn it over to you now.
Well, thanks, Martin, and your expertise and leadership on this were inseparable from where we have gotten, and the detail, the work, the knowledge that you've provided has really been the basis for this bill. I want to begin where you began. More than one mass shooting per day. More than one mass shooting per day. We in Maine experienced the Lewiston tragedy. It was an enormous shock in our state, and yet something like that is happening everywhere in the country every day. And there are multiple ways to deal with this issue. And I want to emphasize that neither Martin or I believe that what we're proposing here is a panacea. There are certainly enormous challenges in the mental health field that we need to address. There are challenges in the communication areas where we have warnings of someone's propensity toward violence and that doesn't quite get to the right law enforcement people. So this isn't the only answer. Universal background checks, of course, should be a baseline. I remember, as you do, Martin, the motto of guns don't kill people, people kill people. Well, if that's true, then keeping guns out of the hands of dangerous people, whether they be felons or those who are dangerously mentally ill to themselves or others, it just makes total sense. But let me talk a bit about the bill today. What we tried to focus on was the lethality of the weapon, not what it looks like. And the principal focus of our bill is a fixed internal magazine of no more than 10 bullets. And fixed and permanent are the key words. The problem is large capacity detachable magazines that allows a mass shooter to continue firing and not have to stop to reload. In fact, the information that I have is that the shooter in Lewiston, Maine, had 2 large capacity magazines duct taped together so that when one was depleted, he could simply flip them around and put the other magazine in place and keep shooting. And we had 18 deaths and a large number of wounded in a very short period of time because of the mechanics of how that worked. So that's really what we're focused on here. Now, the question is the Second Amendment. And I think a place that we should look is Justice Scalia, who was a famously pro-gun, very conservative justice who wrote the leading opinion on gun control and gun laws in our country called Heller versus District of Columbia. And in the Heller opinion, he said, point blank, the Second Amendment is not absolute. There are limits, and there are limits for particularly dangerous weapons, and that limitations on the sale of certain weapons is permissible. And that was one of the reasons it took us a long time to get this bill right, is because we wanted to be sure that it would pass constitutional muster. So we're not talking about taking anybody's gun away. We're not talking about severely limiting the traditional culture of gun use in New Mexico or in Maine. We're talking about restricting the lethality of weapons that are designed more for killing people than doing pretty much anything else. So that's what we're doing today, is introducing this bill. We have 4 original co-sponsors, as Martin mentioned, and the bill is being reviewed by a number of other senators, including some of our Republican colleagues, and we're very much hoping that we can generate some momentum. Now, the question is, can it be passed? Well, not tomorrow, but what my experience has been, and I'm sure Martin has had the same experience, is that you never know when the time will come and the time will be right for a particular piece of legislation, a particular piece of policy. What we're putting on the table today is what we believe is a good faith, constitutionally permissible proposal that will save lives. And I'll end with that. Our goal is very simple: save lives in Maine, in New Mexico, and across the country. Now, I think, I assume that what we're going to do now is take some questions from the New Mexico press and the Maine press.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Senator King. As he just mentioned, we're going to open it up for Q&A now. To ask your question directly, please use the raise hand function and we'll call on you. And please be sure to state your name and affiliation when we call on you. One more time, to ask your question directly, please use the raise hand function and we will unmute you to ask your question. All right, got some questions lining up here. Lindsay Barber, KOAT, please go ahead and ask your question.
Unmute.
All right, Lindsay, I believe you are permitted to unmute your mic.
Oh, that's me. Hi, sorry guys. I'm through the KOAT stuff. This is Julian Potas with KOAT Action 7 News. My question is for Senator Martin Heinrich. Throughout this year, we've covered a few stories, even on the local scale, with Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham and her actions to try to address gun violence in the state. And sometimes it's gotten national press as far as trying to mitigate or figure out how to address gun violence. When we talk about an act like this, and with so many people that are very passionate about their Second Amendment right, what is something that you would say to them about this bill to try to give them cause for pause or some type of calming emotion, because they do get pretty riled up when it comes to issues like this?
Well, I think it's really, we spent an enormous amount of time looking at every Supreme Court case to make sure that we simultaneously protected the Second Amendment and then regulated these incredibly dangerous devices that facilitate mass shootings. And there was a lot of actual guidance there. And it sort of goes back to the successful regulation of machine guns 100 years ago. And we used the same sorts of logic and language to be able to get at this so that it would simultaneously protect traditional handguns, bolt action rifles, traditional shotguns, the kind of things that, you know, many of us in rural communities grew up with. And at the same time, limited the capacity of someone to really do mass harm on the community. And I think we've really painted a bright line between weapons of war and traditional firearms.
And Martin, if I could amplify what you said, I think the best assurance is that, as Martin mentioned, weapons that have been deemed especially dangerous to people, such as machine guns, that is fully automatic, and sawed-off shotguns, have been heavily regulated and essentially banned for 100 years. And what we've come to realize is that these weapons with the high-capacity magazines fit into that category.
Right.
And there's no confiscation. There's no idea of limiting hunting or anything along those lines. In fact, in Maine, the law already is for hunting, you can only have 6 bullets in the gun, 1 in the chamber and 5 in a magazine. So we're not really talking about infringing on the traditional responsible gun use that both of us have experienced in our states. But I think it's important to say there always has been a carve out for weapons deemed especially dangerous to people. And this is simply adding to that list of machine guns and sawed-off shotguns. And it doesn't even prohibit the guns entirely. It just says no high-capacity detachable magazines.
Thank you, Senator King. Next, we'll go to Kevin Miller. Kevin Miller, you have the ability to unmute yourself, so feel free to do so at your convenience.
Great, thank you very much. So I guess my question for Senator King, you had mentioned that this would have potentially prohibited the type of weapon that was used in Lewiston. You gave the example of the shooter apparently duct taping some of the magazines together. Can you talk a little bit more about how this bill would have potentially prohibited him from accessing that gun? Obviously, he owned it already, so it's not retrospective, wouldn't have forced him to give it up. But if someone was trying to buy a weapon like that, talk a little bit more about that specific instance.
Well, what our bill basically says is that in the future, a weapon that is the manufacturer of a weapon, it has to have an internal magazine that will not take a detachable high-capacity magazine. So the fellow in Lewiston had one of these weapons. He had a detachable magazine. My understanding is that it was duct taped to a second magazine that could be quickly changed. That would be prohibited. If you see pictures of these weapons, you see a curved object underneath the trigger. That's the magazine. Under our proposal, the gun would essentially look the same, or could look the same, but it just wouldn't have that device. The magazine would be in the gun. And the key here is that in the midst of a mass shooting, it's when the shooter has to reload that there's an opportunity either for people to escape or for first responders or people that are in the room to disarm the shooter. But if there's no lapse in the firing, then that can't happen. So we're trying to basically what this bill would do would be to build a pause into such an attack. 2 people charged the shooter in Lewiston, but he killed them both because he didn't have to stop and reload. So that's why we're talking about reducing the lethality of the weapon, and that it could have, I certainly can't say it would have, but it certainly could have diminished the devastation of the attack in Lewiston.
Next up, we have Bob Thomas, KRQE.
Hello, this is J.R. Oppenheim. I'm a producer for KRQE News 13 here in Albuquerque, New Mexico. For the question for Senator Heinrich, and maybe if Senator King has something to weigh in us as well, he can feel free. But I'm curious more specifically, Senator Heinrich, I know that you're very familiar with guns and getting how they operate. As far as the gas-powered semi-assault rifles, how prevalent are those in a lot of these mass shooting incidents? I mean, we hear a lot of times specifically about the large magazines, bump stocks. The bump stocks had come up with the Las Vegas, Nevada shooting, right? But specifically with the gas-powered component, how prevalent is that? And how much teeth will that have? Having that specifically mentioned in this bill?
Yeah, when people think of, like, when I got to Congress, if you asked 20 different people what an assault rifle was, you would get 20 different answers. But in really thinking through the mechanics of this, going through the manufacturer's terms, it became evident to me that the commonality is this combination of an action that uses the firing of one round to load the next round almost instantaneously, and large capacity magazines. And this is this is the sort of platform of choice in many, many of these shootings.
Next up, we've got Billy Coben.
Thank you both. It's Billy Coben with the Bangor Daily News in Maine. For both of you, have you spoken with any Republicans yet to try to get a sense of who might be willing to consider this proposal or support it? And for Senator King, have you gotten any more information that you can share on where the Lewiston gunman acquired the guns? I know that he had 3 that police found on him. Just was curious if you've learned more that you can share about that. Thank you both.
I'll take the second question first. I don't have further information. The only understanding I have is that he acquired the guns before these incidents of mental health that manifested themselves last summer. But I don't really have the details. As you know, the governor has established a commission to review this entire matter and the response of various state and local officials. I think that's going to be very important, and look forward to learning more from that proceeding. In terms of our Republican colleagues, we have shared the bill and the background with a number of Republican colleagues. They are reviewing it, and we would, of course, welcome their support. But as of now, we wanted to move forward and introduce the bill with the original co-sponsors. I think it's significant that 3 of the 4 of us, Martin Heinrich, myself, and I'm sorry, Martin Heinrich and I and Mark Kelly from Arizona have never supported a bill of this nature before. But I think 2 things happened. One, the acceleration of these mass shootings, and 2, the realization that there was a way to approach this other than through what the gun looked like. I wrote an op-ed in your newspaper in 2013 where basically I said I wasn't supportive of a so-called assault weapons ban that was based upon what the gun looked like, because I just didn't think that was going to be effective, that manufacturers could simply modify it to conform with the law and you'd still have the same problems. That's why we focused on functionality and lethality rather than appearance. So we're hopeful we're going to be able to generate bipartisan support. As you all know, let's not kid each other. This is a difficult issue, and the bill that Martin led 2 years ago is one of the first significant pieces of firearm legislation in something like 30 years. But we believe that we have to put a responsible and reasonable proposal out there, and that the time will come when the public will say this is something we have to do. And I should mention, by the way, that the polling that I've seen is something like 80+% in favor of universal background checks, and almost 2/3 support for some significant restrictions on these assault weapons. So, and I think as these awful situations like we had in Lewiston continue to multiply, the demand for some reasonable solutions that don't impinge on traditional gun rights and responsible, law-abiding Americans' rights to keep and bear arms are going to be more and more called for by the public.
Mal Meyer, you're up next.
I'm Mal Meyer. I'm one of the reporters for CBS 13 in Portland. My question is for Senator King, since you have been mentioning just needing to build a kind of a coalition of you, if you will, of support as well from across the aisle, especially with Republicans. I'm hoping, Senator King, you can respond to this. Why try to pass this all as one bill? Why not try to break this up into separate pieces?
Well, I think this is not a comprehensive firearm control bill. It really focuses on the elements of the firearm that are prevalent in mass shootings. Bump stocks, which turns a semi-automatic weapon effectively into a machine gun, Glock switches, and large capacity magazines. This is and then of course what Martin mentioned the voluntary buyback provision. This is a comprehensive piece of legislation dealing with the predominant weapons that are used in mass shooting. So I believe that it makes sense and it holds together as a reasonable approach to this particular problem. As I said at the very beginning, this is not a panacea. There are thousands of gun violence incidents in this country involving handguns and other kinds of weapons. This isn't a comprehensive bill. We're focused on the weapon of choice in mass shootings.
And to answer the same thing in a different way, if you look at the Supreme Court rulings and the fact that the regulation of things like sawed-off shotguns and fully automatic weapons has been in place for a century, we ask the question, what else falls into that kind of category versus what falls into the traditional firearm category? And that's how we came up with the list of things that is incorporated into this legislation, and they're all fairly complementary.
Thank you, Senators. We've got time for one last question here. Thanks so much for your patience, Sierra. We'll go ahead to you.
Thank you so much. This is a question for both senators. I'm sorry, Sierra Whaley from WBI TV5 News out of Bangor, Maine. I was just wondering why it was so important to include the voluntary buyback program, and if you think that program could spark more conversation between people who feel differently about the topic.
One of the reasons, oh, Angus, you go ahead.
Well, I was going to say the key word is voluntary. Here's the situation. There are between 20 and 30 million of these weapons on the street. And our bill is principally focused on the manufacture of new weapons, but to ignore the fact that there are so many already out there, it doesn't really fully address the problem. There is no limitation on people's ability to keep the arms that they have, to pass them on to family members. The question is, if they decide to sell it, then there's a voluntary buyback program that will compensate them, just as if they were selling it to somebody down the street. But eventually, the idea is that this will slowly diminish the number of these weapons that are available out in our communities.
And if you don't incorporate some sort of voluntary buyback element, you have to deal with a secondary market in these dangerous arms. You have to deal with a stockpiling issue. It's really over time important that element is in there.
All right. Thanks so much, Senators. It looks like that's all the time we have for now. Both senators have to go and do their constitutional duty to vote. So with that, as a reminder, we'll be sharing this video with all of those of you who have registered. I've dropped all of our contact information in the chat. Feel free to reach out if you do have any other further questions. Again, we will be sure to get that video to all of you who have registered, and just want to say thank you again so much for joining us today on such a momentous day. And with that, we will go ahead and wrap. Thanks again, folks.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Martin.